Colombia's most violent election in decades is coming to a head this weekend. Security forces are on alert for potential attacks ahead of Sunday's presidential runoff. It comes after a campaign cycle that's seen dozens of political leaders killed, including a presidential candidate who was shot to death last year. Now, the election has stirred up painful memories of Colombia's paramilitary past. In fact, both of the final candidates have had their lives shaped in different ways by the country's armed conflict. Journalist Richard McColl joins me from the Colombian capital, Bogota, to break it down. Richard, good to have you with us.
Thank you very much for having me. Yes, this election that we have on Sunday, of course, is offering Colombians two radically differing options to deal with public security, and in particular for those living under the authority of criminal armed groups within the country. We have the current frontrunner, that's Abelardo de la Espriella, who is a hard right candidate, very much taking a leaf out of the Trump playbook, and indeed has been endorsed by President Trump in the United States. He believes, of course, in the strong hand and combat once again in the country, trying to knock back guerrilla groups and criminal armed groups. His past, he's a lawyer, he's a criminal lawyer. And then on the left, we have the continuity candidate, a long-term senator, that's Iván Cepeda. He would, of course, is the named successor of Gustavo Petro, the current president who can't run again. And his belief is of dialogue and human rights.
Richard, these two candidates, Cepeda on the left, Espriella on the far right, they've both been shaped by different experiences with Colombia's armed conflict. Tell us more about that.
Well, I'll start with Iván Cepeda, who's a very interesting character. His father was a member of the Communist Party here in Colombia, and they had to flee into exile. So Iván Cepeda, much of his education was done overseas behind the Iron Curtain. In fact, he even studied at university in Bulgaria. So, of course, his politics have been defined by this, although he does say that being behind the Iron Curtain during the bad years in Bulgaria has moved him away from the authoritarian nature of communism and indeed socialism. His father was sadly murdered as well by paramilitary groups or right-wing groups, and that has really defined his life. He went into human rights defense and has always now been campaigning on behalf of victims of the state, most importantly, those victims of the false positive scandal where more than 7,000 youngsters were tempted away by the military with promises of work and then were dressed up, latterly killed, and painted as being guerrilla groups to inflate numbers. Now, and De La Espriella himself, right-wing criminal lawyer with some very interesting connections in his past. These have been coming out in recent weeks. Indeed, he's defended members of the right-wing paramilitary groups in Colombia. He set up some businesses in Florida. There's no real knowledge as to where his massive amounts of wealth come from. There are allegations of fraud and involvement in different illegal activities within Ecuador and elsewhere.
And just in the last stages of campaigning, both sides have actually accused the other of direct personal involvement with violent militias during Colombia's armed conflict. Tell us more about that.
Well, it's an interesting one because Abelardo de la Espriella, of course, was very much connected to the AUC paramilitary groups. He has represented almost every single one of the top members of these right-wing paramilitary groups. So it's interesting for him to accuse anyone else. Iván Cepeda obviously comes from the left, from a communist family. So, of course, anyone with a kind of leftist tilt in Colombia is immediately, painted with the brush of being a guerrilla sympathizer. But Iván Cepeda, while you could say, of course, he has his left-wing credentials and so on, he has never believed in the sort of taking up arms and military action in Colombia. He is a strong believer of dialogue, whereas Abelardo de la Espriella is very different to that and believes in the mano dura, so therefore very similar to a Trump doctrine towards the conflict within Colombia.
Now, ahead of this runoff, the current president, Gustavo Petro, called on voters to keep the election peaceful. I want to just listen to what he said before we talk more.
As president and leader, acting on the mandate of the people, I say this: no one must attack anyone on Sunday, under any circumstances. We look upon everyone with love, even those who insult or attack us, but we will protect the vote.
Richard, how big are the security concerns over this runoff election?
Well, it's Colombia. And of course, we've had a dreadful run-in. As you mentioned earlier, the assassination of Miguel Uribe a year ago, or last year, as he was on the campaign trail, a former presidential hopeful. And of course, the threats against social leaders and community leaders in these far out areas within Colombia. This is Colombia. It's a very violent country. And indeed, there's always a concern of violence, and especially in electoral season. However, on the day of elections, what we'll likely see is sort of voter coercion, of course, vote buying, and indeed intimidation, voter intimidation, rather than actual sort of outbreaks of violence or, as you'd imagine, sort of gunfights in the street. So what we'll see is the different side of violence, very much a suggested violence that could then extend over time here in Colombia, always a concern.
We are hearing, though, a lot of voters very concerned about the rise of violence in the country. This was a major issue in the election campaign, and it's an issue that has stirred up a lot of memories of Colombia's armed conflict. So I'm wondering, how have the candidates promised to solve it?
Yes, I mean, it's interesting because, of course, whoever comes into power and whoever takes up the mantle in August as the new president is overseeing a country with a expanded and increased criminal activity within the borders. The numbers of people in arms, let's say criminal groups and guerrilla groups, is now up to something like 27,000 armed people. So there is a great concern. And of course, both candidates are addressing this entirely differently. Whereas Ivan Cepeda on the left would like to address the root causes of the violence, so therefore addressing the socio-economic causes, making Colombia a more equitable place, dialogue, human rights, and beyond. De la Espriella has also, well, he's walked back in the last day or so, but he campaigned on a basis of 90 days shock tactics of fumigating coca fields, that's coca, the base product for cocaine, picking out 10 high-ranking targets of guerrilla groups that were going to be assassinated or indeed imprisoned, and of course, major armed offensives. Also, he said he'd like to invite for joint military exercises within Colombia with the United States Armed Forces.
Now, back in 2016, the Colombian government made a successful peace deal with the biggest left-wing guerrilla group in the country, FARC. Today, Colombia's biggest remaining guerrilla group is the ELN. They say they're watching this election to see if they'll continue fighting the government or not. Let's take a listen.
If whoever arrives at the presidential palace opens space for dialogue, the ELN will always be willing to talk. If not, we will continue to oppose whoever wins.
A representative of the ELN guerrilla group there, which violently opposes the Colombian government, saying they could be open to negotiating peace depending on who wins this election. Richard, do Colombians still believe that peaceful negotiation can work?
Well, I'd say that about, just under 50% still believe in it because the 49% who voted for Ivan Cepeda in the first round, of course, are voting for dialogue, are voting for peace and obviously dialogues with these guerrilla groups. But then you look at the other side, the ELN have negotiated with 7 different Colombian presidents. And if there was ever a better time to negotiate, it was with this government of Gustavo Petro, of course, himself a former guerrilla, the president himself being of the M19 group. This would have been the time to have negotiated. Of course, these talks have failed, and the ELN has increased in numbers to around 6,500 combatants. So again, you have a war-weary and incredibly tired Colombian public. Do they trust him? Well, half don't and half do. And does the ELN really want peace? This is the question at the end of it. It's very difficult for you to negotiate with a guerrilla group that controls 2 sections of different countries, controls parts of Colombia, and of course strategic positions of coca growing areas, that's coca for cocaine paste, in Colombia, and of course for smuggling and so on. And then of course controls massive swathes of parts of Venezuela where there are critical minerals. So it's not a Colombian problem alone. It is an international problem. Therefore, it cannot be addressed only within Colombia.
But Colombian voters will have the choice if they want a more peaceful or a less peaceful approach to this going forward. I want to ask you, you mentioned Venezuela next door. The United States has been asserting its influence in the region, most notably in Venezuela, right next to Colombia. How will the new president of Colombia deal with Donald Trump and this growing U.S. influence?
Well, should it be Abelardo de la Espriella, of course, the hard right candidate? He himself is actually a U.S. citizen. He's a naturalized U.S. citizen. He thinks this is an advantage to him with Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump has openly, on several occasions, backed Abelardo de la Espriella. Obviously, he's looking to see another domino fall here in the area and sort of going along with the tradition now that seems to be turning to the right, Bolivia, Honduras, Ecuador, and beyond. Will Colombia be the next one? So Abelardo de la Espriella thinks that this obviously is to his benefit. If it's Ivan Cepeda, well, it will be an antagonistic relationship, but I doubt that it will be as bad as the relationship that Gustavo Petro has currently with Donald Trump. Gustavo Petro, very much a belligerent and outspoken person, whereas Ivan Cepeda is a more ethically minded and indeed more careful on social media. Perhaps you could liken Ivan Cepeda, should he win, his presidency might be similar to that of Bernardo Arévalos in Guatemala, whereas they are so ideologically different that they're never going to be friends, but there's one of pragmatic sort of realism between the two. Now, Venezuela, a difficult situation for Colombia, the neighboring country. We don't really know what's happening now under the presidency of Delcy Rodriguez, who continues to oppress Venezuela there, but of course says the right things and does the right things for the US government and their interests. Any new Colombian government here will be expected to toe the line with the US through the prism with which they see this region, and that is in illegal migration, illicit economies, and of course, critical minerals.
Richard McColl, thanks so much for talking to us. Who do you think will win Colombia's election? And what do you think is the right approach to dealing with armed groups in the country? Let us know in the comments. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe.